So thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm not sure whether you have heard from anyone from Ofcom, probably not, or anyone from governments on the subject of IoT before. We obviously have a slightly different perspective on it. We come at it from a completely different direction, and I'm going to give you a bit of insight into what we've been doing on this in the next 10 minutes or so. But first, in the spirit of demonstrating that there are no new things in the world, the first debate about technology and data privacy really took place about 130 years ago in the US, when Kodak invented the first portable camera. And that invention, alongside the advent of mass circulation newspapers, led to all hell breaking loose, really, as people bought these cameras and took photos of people in polite society and then made them available for all manner of people to see. And this led to a bit of an uproar, and a few years later, in about just before the turn of the century actually, a law in the US whereby there was a penalty of about $1,000 and a year in prison if anyone was caught taking a photo of someone without written permission in advance. Now you can see from where we are today that problem has kind of been solved, but the point is that when people, as I'll talk in a few slides, when we first approached the IoT, we were told the major concern stakeholders had was data privacy, and people couldn't really see any easy way forward to solving those particular issues. But if this is anything to go by, then the solutions should be apparent in due course. What I want to do with the presentation today is firstly let you know that the IoT is on Ofcom's radar, that we think it has some fantastic opportunity to deliver benefits to consumers, to businesses, the UK as a whole, but also that we are actively trying to work out what we can do to promote the IoT's development, if in fact we need to do anything at all. It may well be that we don't have to do anything, in which case we're very happy to be told that, and to make sure that we are not making a barrier to the development of the IoT. Okay, so that's why we're interested in it. What have we done about it? Well, first of all, a few years ago, we wanted to explore what the size and shape of the IoT would be. Now, this is just one of any number of studies that have been undertaken in the UK and further afield over the years to try and come up with these mind-boggling figures for the size of the IoT. We weren't, to be honest, really interested in the detail. What we wanted to know was the broad direction of travel, and the main reason we wanted to get an idea for this was from our perspective of spectrum management. Could we be absolutely certain that now, as the IoT develops, and in the future, there's enough spectrum to support the IoT? The conclusion was, broadly, from this study undertaken by consultants for us, that firstly, this was, as you can see a couple of years ago, that the IoT wasn't something that was around the corner. They were absolutely adamant in their conclusion that the IoT is here already, and they cited a good number of devices. I think there's about 40 million devices in operation in the UK at that time. It's not entirely clear to me whether they were proper IoT devices or whether they were machine-to-machine devices. But anyway, the message is the IoT is here, that it's diverse, and over the coming 10 years or so had the potential to grow into an enormous market, and the biggest category of which was going to be intelligent buildings. They reckon in total by 2022 there will be about 360 million IoT devices in the UK. More recently, in the last 6 months or so, we realised, it kind of occurred to us, it's been 2 years since we've done anything like this for the IoT, and things may have moved on, so let's do another study just to update that. This, as you can see, is the previous estimate of how the IoT would look in 2022, and this is the revised study. Now, some things to point out here. Firstly, they're obviously very different, but I would expect there to be differences. It was done by different consultants. They used different methodologies. They used a different categorization for each of these types of service. But I was surprised at just how different the shape and size of the IoT was expected to be by 2020. This is essentially just over 100 million IoT devices as opposed to 360. So actually, just to pause for a second, do these figures mean anything to you working in the industry? Is this, for example, do you think that it's right that intelligent buildings isn't likely to be such a large market in the future? Do you agree that there's a fairly consistent view that utilities and automotive are likely to be big areas? And what about health? That was expected to be quite a big market for IoT, whereas more recently the view of the consultants was it would be much smaller. I mean, we can discuss later, but broadly, is this an outrage, or is this something that looks kind of familiar to you?
I'm surprised the most recent graph there is reduced intelligent buildings so significantly. Mm-hmm. Just today I was over in Falkirk with a client who, in their name, is intelligent buildings, and they're building a 60-storey building down in London, fully intelligent, from the lift to the basement to the cars park, the car parks right up to the flats that's going to be hosting the people in it, and they're not stopping. They're needing us to go ahead with them. That's phenomenal. If that's what's now changed, but
what are you counting? Like IP addresses or something?
These are connections. So yeah, essentially, or devices. Yeah. It may be that some of those intelligent buildings have now been recategorised as utilities, but either way, it's still a fairly significant drop.
What about sorry? I was going to say, what about companies such that would be producing like fruit and veg, for example? Because that's a full life cycle there. Again, I cover the UK, and we seem to all of a sudden now sparkling interest in this market where these companies are, planting the crops in their own fields, lifting them out the ground, cleaning them, packaging them, and then selling them on. That is all of a sudden exploded. What would that kind of fall under within there? Would that be others, or that kind of market?
It's a very good question, and it may well be. I think in others there was agriculture, but agriculture could involve. There might be transport in there as well. So it is down to the characterisation, and I'll come back to that shortly. Sorry, was there one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's legislation that's driving utilities, automotive, these things are forcing.
Yeah.
So maybe there's in like smart buildings and things like that, there's no legislation like what is way really, it's going to force it, and until it does, that's what I've seen in the past.
Good point. One thing I would say, actually, one of the conclusions I take from this is I take this with a pinch of salt, because if we do this in another couple of years, it may be completely different as well. And it just emphasised what I said previously, that this is really to give us a broad direction, idea of the broad direction of the IoT, and also emphasises that if you want to get a better idea of what the IoT is going to look like, then you actually need to go out and speak to the people that are doing the work. So your point about the agriculture and the transportation. I mean, these are applications which don't really fall very easily into categorisation, but they are important applications all the same. So the more you learn about the people that are developing the technologies, developing the services, the more valuable the insight, I think, which takes you beyond just colourful pie charts. And the other point as well is that what this doesn't take into account are those applications or categories of applications which haven't yet been thought of. These are all, by the very nature, you know these because you've categorised them, but there might be some applications around the corner that haven't yet been really thought of or developed, and they don't feature at all. They're just, either they're not in there at all, or they're in others. So, what could Ofcom do about the IoT? Now, there are a number of areas which largely stem from our duties, which I'll just quickly whiz through. Firstly, we have a general duty to promote investment in innovation. We do that in a number of ways. That could be through making information available to consumers or to new entrants. That could be also making network infrastructure available, shared network infrastructure available, so new service providers can deploy services. In terms of making information available, we, as I mentioned in my introduction earlier, we report regularly on the state of the UK's communications infrastructure. So what's coverage like for consumers, what are speeds like, what is quality of service, what is resilience. And we do this not only to give consumers an idea about the quality of their services, but also it kind of holds operators' feet to the fire. They know that if their network is underperforming compared to their competitors, then that information is going to be in the public domain. In terms of security, we have certain duties under the European Framework Directive to ensure in one way or another that electronic communication services networks are adequately secure. And there's a link there to some of the work we perceive we'd have to do on IoT. We are responsible for the management of spectrum. This is one of our major duties, and that means, actually it's back to the study on one of the previous graphs, it involves us making sure that we are aware of how uses of spectrum will evolve over the coming years, so that we can make sure that sufficient spectrum is available, not just for the big sexy items like 5G, but also for some of the other services, uses of spectrum. We also need to make sure that spectrum is free of interference. And lastly, perhaps less relevant these days for the IoT, in fact, go back a couple of years to when we first started looking at the IoT, we were petitioned quite strongly by some stakeholders who suggested we need to make sure there were sufficient telephone numbers available for IoT devices, because every IoT device connected to a network would need to have its own telephone number. We didn't necessarily believe that, and I think that requirement has disappeared with time. But if we do, for whatever reason, need to assign telephone numbers, and that's something that is within our remit. So spectrum, this is our entry point to spectrum, to the IoT. The analysis that we've undertaken and the views of the stakeholders we've spoken to, those people deploying networks, for example, is that the availability of spectrum isn't acting as a barrier to the deployment of the IoT, and is unlikely to in the future. That's even with the deployment in 10 years or so of millions of devices. They think that there's sufficient spectrum available, but we're not complacent. We do keep an eye on the amount of spectrum that's being used and the degree to which it is actually subject to interference. Why do we think that there's sufficient spectrum? Well, crudely, you can break this down to three ways in which IoT devices will communicate. One is that they will be short-range applications, typically using technologies like Bluetooth or Zigbee or even Wi-Fi. And in that sense, they will make use of spectrum on a license-exempt basis. So anyone can just go out and buy those devices and deploy them without need for a license. Secondly, there are longer range applications that may use technologies, IoT bespoke technologies such as LoRa or Sigfox, which could make use of spectrum on a license-exempt basis, or they might need a license. It's entirely up to the band they choose to operate in. Or the final category is those applications that operate over long range and operate off the back of an existing cellular network. So they might make use of these emerging technologies that are evolutions of 2, 3 or 4G, such as NB-IoT or LTM. Now, just as an observation, when we started out on IoT, the people that were speaking to us, the members of industry that were speaking to us most frequently about IoT were those that were interested in deploying that middle category. That's the Sigfox type or weightless or those kind of new and emerging technologies. Over the past couple of years, what's changed is that we're getting a lot more interaction from the mobile operators. We still get some from the first category as well. But what's happened over the past couple of years, perhaps as a result of there being a much clearer, stable picture of what the standards look like, the technology standards look like, the mobile operators now feel that they can play a much more full role in the IoT. It's not up to us, of course, to decide which is best of those different approaches. It's just up to us to make sure that whichever model is chosen by an operator, that they can deploy that technology. There's enough spectrum. And what have we done over the past couple of years? There's a band of spectrum beneath 900 megahertz that we've made available on a licensing basis. So anyone with the right technology can operate in that band without need to come back to us to ask for a license. We've also made that same band available with a flexible licensing regime, so you can use higher powers to get over longer ranges. And we were the first in Europe to make that available. We spent a considerable amount of time since trying to get other countries in Europe to adopt that. We've also liberalised the spectrum licenses that the mobile operators have. So if an operator chooses to deploy one of the new technologies such as NB-IoT, they don't have to come back to us to have their license changed. They can just deploy that alongside their existing mobile network. And also we keep an eye on, almost audit the some bands of spectrum that we think aren't being used at all. We recently sought the input from industry on a few bands below 100 megahertz that just weren't being used for anything that we didn't think could be used, could be moved somewhere else, and we couldn't think of any other use for that spectrum than IoT. So we sought the views of industry about whether we should make that available for the IoT. One comment that was very strongly put to us by stakeholders over the years is it's great that we do identify little bits of spectrum and then say, would you like to use that for IoT? But we need to try as hard as we can to get harmonisation with the rest of Europe and ideally further afield, because there's little market for something which is just going to sell in the UK. We need to make sure that that same technology, those same chipsets and those same devices can be sold in Europe and further afield. And we still continue to work with other regulatory groups in Europe to try and get some kind of joined up coordinated response and approach to IoT. Security. I put this slide together and it occurred to me that I don't actually understand it, so I hope no one has any questions. But there are some things I want to say about it, but all of this, okay. So security, again, was identified by stakeholders as being a real concern. And we do, as I said in a previous slide, have some duties in this area. It's important to note that security means different things to different people. So it could be a concern about whether your data, your personal data, is being kept securely, or it could be a concern about whether your service is free from or protected from being somehow interfered with by a malicious third party. And you could break it down into concerns about device security, whether concern about your webcam being hacked or your personal data being stolen from a device. Concerns about a service, so this could be your cloud provider or a service provider in the cloud that is using your data in a way that you weren't quite prepared for, or someone otherwise having access to that data and making use of it. Or it could be, thirdly, a concern about network security, whereby traffic is somehow intercepted or accessed in some way as it's transmitted between nodes in a network. Now, I make this distinction for an important reason, and that is devices are completely unregulated. There's nothing we can do about those devices at present. For services, well, if it's personal data that's being accessed, then there is something that someone can do, and that really is that within the remit of the Information Commissioner's office. We don't have the duties or the competence in that area. I say that, but there are some circumstances in which that might be the case. The point here is that we'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, depending on whether it's a public service or a private service. Essentially, it's quite complicated. And the third issue is about network security. Well, this does fall within our remit, but the thing is, it's just unlikely that's probably the least likely attack vector. And you consider how difficult it is just to dip into a network and just pluck a few packets off of that and steal or otherwise compromise your data in that way. So our security powers really relate to public communication services and networks. The key word here is public. You think about some of these devices, some of these services we heard about today, like Rebecca's smart home. Then you imagine you have Nest, or you have lights, smart lights.
Yeah, for the Hue lights.
Okay, so your Hue lights. You imagine that service. You have the devices in the home that are connected to a bridge using Zigbee on a license exempt basis, and then they're connected over your broadband connection to a service in the cloud. So there you have those. You have device, network, and service. If something happens if someone compromises Hue's service, then there's nothing that Ofcom can really do about that. It may fall to the ICO, but it just illustrates the difficulty. If it's something in the home, then it's using a local area connection over a licensed exempt spectrum. There's nothing much we can do about that necessarily, unless someone's causing interference. The connection from the internet to the home over your service provider, well, that is a public network, and whoever provides your service needs to make sure they've taken the steps required to keep your data secure. But so you can see in that relatively simple and familiar situation, it's not entirely clear at each point in time who is responsible if there's a security issue. But what is absolutely certain is the people involved or who have an issue, like Ofcom, like the ICO, and like government, take this very seriously. And it's just a case of trying to work out at the right time who is involved, and a lot of this involves us working together with people, and especially with government and with industry. And I mention industry for this particular reason, that I mentioned at the beginning about how important it is to speak to people actually deploying the service and making the devices. And data privacy was one of those areas that really brought it home to us, because if you look at data privacy as a massive great issue, it's difficult to work out with any sense of clarity how big the issue is, or what its exact nature is. You have to actually start drilling down and looking at particular services. A way we've looked at it in the past is to say it's one of three particular slants of the problem. Now, firstly, technical. We know that IoT devices may not have screens or keyboards. If you're trying to impart information to users about how their data is going to be used, it may not be as straightforward or as familiar to users as using their mobile phone or using a computer. So is there merit in having a common way to give that information to consumers and then getting their consent for sharing data? Or is this not a problem, we wonder, because if this is a problem of private data, then not all IoT devices are going to have private data. There might be some consumer devices that have the ability to capture personal data, but then they may be configured by use of a smartphone, in which case the problem could be solved. Alternatively, they could be industrial or agricultural applications, in which case they might be installed by a professional, in which case maybe the technical side isn't that big an issue. It could be a policy problem, in which case we need to look at whether we need to revisit the issue of informed consent. How can we be certain that the users know how their data is going to be used? How can we just assume that they've read the terms and conditions? We know they don't read terms and conditions. We know, I think of that example a few years ago in London when 6 people gave up their firstborn child in return for access to a free Wi-Fi service. And it was all in the terms and conditions. It was an experiment to work out whether people actually read the terms and conditions. It was called the Herod Clause. And we did some investigations ourselves to try and understand why people don't read the terms and conditions. And you know, this is us we're talking about. We know why we don't read them. They're too long, too complicated. No one stands over us. No one forces us to read them, and we're not forced to give a physical signature, which seems to be important for some people. And I read this because this was I thought quite interesting, that even law students, we found, were found to have significant problems in understanding terms and conditions. Studies investigating the readability of terms and conditions consistently found that at least university-level reading skills are needed to understand them. And these are standard terms and conditions. They get worse if you're looking at trying to improve them in quotes, to make them more transparent and accessible. And the last problem here is that accepting terms and conditions at the moment is binary. Either you accept or you decline. And with the IoT, maybe we need to explore something in between where you may accept to share your data, but you may have some caveats, like you may want to restrict who has access to it or what is done with it. And finally, user behavior. We know that a paradox is that users say they're very concerned about data privacy, but as we just said, they don't read the terms and conditions. We know that they value the use of Oyster cards in London, but they don't really give a thought to what's being done with their personal data. The same with store cards. And with Facebook, even in light of privacy concerns, people are still happy to share the most the private data. And perhaps there is the fear of the opportunity cost of not being involved. So maybe another way of getting the point across to consumers for IoT is to put it in terms of what they might be missing out on if they don't share the data. But again, that is something which we need to explore with the Information Commissioner's Office, because in the UK they have the competence.
How are we doing for time here?
We are
Because
about to finish.
We've got another speaker and the panel, and I'd love to cover some of those points in the Q&A session at the end, and the GDPR as well, which is a can of worms that I'd like to get your opinion on. So if we could wrap that up.
I'm happy not to give the last slide. I'll be even happy if you don't ask me about the GDPR.
I know. That's the elephant in the room.
But the one thing I would like to say.
That'll be talked about.
One thing I would like to say is that it's an admission that many of these slides were given in a presentation 2 years ago. I haven't changed them. And I think the IoT has moved on quite a lot, but it hasn't moved on at all from the regulatory side. And I wonder whether that's because genuinely things are moving in the right direction, we don't have to worry yet, or is it because we just don't know what's happening in industry? And so it just underlines the point I made a couple of times in this presentation, that it's important for us to engage with people developing technologies, devices and services, and also to let you know that if there's anything you want to ask us, or if there's anything you want to engage with us about, then please just get in touch and we'd like to take that forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric.